Alexander III came to the throne after the death of his father Alexander II. He began his reign in 1881 and was a strong leader. He was angry that his father had been killed by revolutionaries and immediately sought to hunt them down and execute them. He had seen that his father gave the Russian people reforms and that they had not been very grateful. So Alexander III decided to strengthen autocracy. After all, it had worked for hundreds of years before. Power should not be given to these dark masses. So Alexander III can be said to have reversed the reforms of his father to a degree. Historians call this period the reaction, and Alex III is reactionary. In terms of the A-level exam, the course starts in 1881, and what you need to know is how Russia changed. Alexander II was progressive, granting reforms and modernising Russia, but Alexander III does reverse some of these reforms, and in the exam you'll be asked to consider the impact of this. It will become clearer as we head towards the First Revolution, but now back to Alexander III's reign. In 1881, Alexander III introduced the Statute of State Security. This made it illegal for groups to meet, showing his fear in the rise of revolutionary activity. He changed the judicial reform of his father, trial by jury, so that he could be in more control of making sure revolutionaries got what they deserved. Alexander III was influenced by his tutor, Konstantin Pobedonoshtsev, who was leader of the Russian Church. The Church supported autocracy and tradition. It believed that the Tsar was God's chosen leader, and therefore going against the Tsar was going against God. The Church strongly supported Alexander III's move back to strengthen autocracy. The Church took control over the schools and universities, which had been autonomous or independent under Alexander II. Alexander III was inundated with letters asking for further reforms from the Russian people, who hoped that Alexander III would modernise Russia and carry on the good work of his father. In reaction to this, Alexander III produced a manifesto stating that his reign would be one of unshakable autocracy. This put the hopes of the people to bed. Alexander was showing them that his reign would be a return to how Russia had been ruled for hundreds of years. Alexander didn't just reverse the reforms of his father. In some respects he carried them on. Russification was intensified under Alexander III. His father had wanted this to be voluntary to unite the country. Alexander III forced the people to be Russian. All legal documents were in Russian. Schools taught in Russian. Daily trading was in Russian. People were forced to adhere to Russian culture. Now, because the country was made up of so many different minorities, with over 22 different languages, different cultures, customs and values, this alienated and angered the different minorities. Alexander III's liberal ministers resigned after the Unshakable Autocracy document, and the control was finally back in the hands of the Tsar. He was a strong leader, hated corruption, and brought a degree of stability to Russia, but he was anti-Semitic and launched terrible pogroms against Jews. Despite all this, he did have some ministers who tried to make things easier for Russians. Nikolai Bunge, Minister of the Interior, came up with factory inspections. This was to improve health and safety in factories, especially for women and children. However, this was largely ineffective, as there were only around 200 inspectors throughout the whole of Russia, and the people didn't trust them, believing they were spying on their work output, so usually refused to cooperate. Bunge also introduced the Land Bank, which gave loans to peasants so they could buy their own land. Bunge also put into place procedures for hiring and firing workers, paying wages and workers' fines, the procedure for them. Another Minister of the Interior, Nikolai Ignatiev, made sure everyone was part of the redemption process. After Alexander II emancipated the serfs, the landowners who were losing their workforce needed to be compensated. So the emancipated serfs had to pay for their freedom. This was called redemption payments, and were a real burden. The payments were heavy and would take over a lifetime to pay off. The peasants already were suffering with poverty, but these redemption payments pushed them to extremes. By bringing all peasants into the redemption process, Ignatiev lowered payments slightly. He did believe that by granting certain reforms, he could increase peasant loyalty. He also made it easier to rent state land, and hoped to make further reform, but he was sacked by Alexander III. Ivan Vishnegradsky, his Minister of Finance, introduced taxes and tariffs to try and increase state revenue. Income rose 50% through tariffs, and there was an 18% increase in grain export. Growth in the Russian economy helped secure French loans after 1888. However, in 1891–2, Russia had bad harvests and led to famine. Approximately 1.5 million died. The peasantry, already under the burden of redemption payments and heavy taxes, and then Vishnegradsky's tax, couldn't cope. Famine attracted widespread liberal opposition in Russia and cost Vishnegradsky his job. So to summarise, in terms of repression, you can remember it as Remo, Russification, Education, the Mir, and the Okhrana. Russian was forced upon the population. Everyone had to read, speak and write in Russian. Russification certainly was intensified. In terms of education, the church played a major role. The number of church schools were increased, and members of the clergy, pupils attending school, increased. There was a rise in spiritual literature and church festivals to try and entice people back, and Pobedonostsev, as head of the church, was responsible for doing this. The Mir leader was given more power, and it was made harder for peasants to leave the Mir. By 1893, peasants were banned from leaving. And finally, the powers of the Okhrana were extended. They became highly efficient at closing down printing presses and hunting down revolutionaries. Alexander III had another finance minister called Sergei Witte. He spans the reign of both Alexander and his son Nicholas, and there is an individual video. Please see that.